Hi and welcome to the TechF1 Show. I'm Matt Summerfield and most of you know me as Summers F1 from my blog or Twitter, and obviously you may have seen my writing over on PitPass and various other F1 style websites. I look at the technical side of the sport and try to help you understand the intricacies of the sport and break things down to a much more understandable format. So in this episode we're looking at Monza, and first off let's have a look at Red Bull Racing. So, Red Bull Racing, like many of the other teams, will have had specific upgrades just for Monza, which, if we have a look at the first front wing that the team were using through free practice 1 and 2 on the Friday, that particular wing there is pretty much the copy of what we saw the team use at Spa. Obviously the team will look at that and work out what advantages they will get from taking a lower downforce configuration for Monza. Obviously, because of the type of circuit you have at Monza, it's very much a straight circuit where you want to reduce as much drag as possible. There's only a few chicanes and some medium downforce corners in there just to throw it in the mix, but it's predominantly a very high speed circuit, and I think you spend about 70% of the time on full throttle. So this is the new wing that Red Bull took to free practice 3 and ran throughout the race. It's a cascade-less wing, so the cascade is the section that normally sits in this area off the end plate here, and that cascade's job is to direct the airflow rearwards around the front tyre, so it will send the airflow left of the tyre in this situation, obviously right on the other side of the car, and up and over the wheel. It's all about managing the airflow. So the cascades are not so important on such a circuit where downforce isn't critical. Obviously Monza being a high speed circuit, it's not as critical as other circuits. We can also see, obviously with a cascadeless arrangement, just how complex the Red Bull front wing is. So we have 7 tiers. You may have heard me talk about that in the past. Only Red Bull and Ferrari have a 7-tier wing at present, and that's purely the outside sections of the wing here. If you count them up, there's 7 there. Obviously in the interior of the wing we have 4 flaps, so we have the main plane and then we have a division of 4 flaps there. What's also interesting from Red Bull for Monza is that they also cut away a section of the top flap just here to try and reduce some of the downforce, and obviously how it would affect the wake around the front tyre. So this is the adjuster here. This is which sets the angle for the rear wing, front wing, and then obviously the flap, as we can see, has been cut away just here. It usually sits just above it, where in line with this one here. This is Sebastian Vettel's wing that was used through free practice 3, qualifying in the race. And as we can see in the previous picture, we've just got the cutaway just on the top section of the flap just here up to the adjuster. But if we have a look at Mark Webber, he obviously decided that he wanted a little less front downforce. So the team have actually lowered the angle of attack on the wing, and they've also cut away this out at the inner section of the front wing here just to reduce downforce even further. Obviously that will have an onward impact on the flow to the rest of the car, and we're only talking tenths of a second here, but those are differences between the drivers and the way that they want their car set up. So obviously Webber running with a little less downforce on the front wing than his teammate Vettel. I mentioned this rear wing in the last show for Spa, and the difference between this wing that the team took to Spa and tested at Spa and their normal configuration rear wing is the fact that the angle of attack on the rear wing is actually much shallower, so it doesn't produce as much downforce, and obviously that's good when you're wanting a top speed. But also, if we see in the little magnified section just here, it's missing the end plate louvers. Those louvers, their job is to control the airflow, so they allow airflow to pass between either side of the wing, therefore reducing the drag. What normally happens is that basically the airflow will get pinched in the corner, and the airflow starts to spiral. It's the difference between the pressure gradient, so you get the high pressure meeting the low pressure, and the airflow starts to spiral away, and that creates drag, obviously, because you end up in a situation where the wing isn't as efficient as it maybe should be. So obviously Red Bull concentrating on low downforce packaging, just as many as the other teams did, and that's their solution to Monza. Moving on to Mercedes. Obviously Mercedes took some fairly decent upgrades to the Spa Grand Prix. So for Monza, we perhaps wasn't expecting such large revisions, but again they've produced another new rear wing. On this rear wing, if we look firstly at the main plane and the top flap, in the Spa version it was, obviously as we see now, perhaps a more Spa orientated rear wing, specifically for that circuit, whereas the main plane and the top flap were designed so that the central section was actually higher than the outer portions. So we're leveraging downforce and a loss of drag from that particular wing. So this is a more Monza specific wing where we've just reduced the angle of attack of the wing. It's quite a shallow section. Normally you'd see a much higher angle on the wing. Because of that, obviously there isn't as much room to have the end plate louvres, as I've just talked about with Red Bull, and those louvres have been reduced to 2 on this particular wing. So obviously it's how you manage downforce versus drag. This particular team have opted for a different version than what we saw on the Red Bull. What we have seen retained on this particular wing compared to the previous iteration is the end plate strakes just here. Those are used to control vortices, and it's something that Mercedes introduced on the Spa rear wing. But what's quite interesting is the tyre wake slots that we've got in the leading edge of the end plate here. Those have been increased significantly from the previous version. They're probably double the size, and I believe that those have been designed in that particular manner in order to help with the dragging that's been induced, just as I've talked about on the previous Red Bull wing at the outer portions of the rear wing. So I think that might be a Monza specific end plate, just purely because of the design of the tyre wake slot and also the reduction of louvres. Also for the rear wing, the team went on to design a new beam wing. Usually the beam wing on the Mercedes is a very straightforward singular piece. This is still a singular piece, but what we have is a curved element in the centre section here. So the curved centre section is more at a higher angle of attack, whereas the exterior parts here are at a much shallower angle of attack. And the idea of that is to leverage downforce from the central portion of the wing, whereas on the outer portions there'll be a drag reduction. And here we see Mercedes in free practice 1, I believe this was. In fact it was their delta lap effectively. It was an exploratory lap by Nico Rosberg using the drag reduction device. Now the drag reduction device is the little periscope that's fitted up underneath the rear wing here, and we can obviously see a massive angle of attack difference here on the rear wing. The normal sort of 5-6 louvres in the end, and the much smaller tyre wake slots. So obviously you can see the difference there between that and the Monza specific rear wing. But that was just the team getting a lap delta from the drag reduction device, and also obviously having a quick assessment of how that would be suited around Monza itself. Moving on to Ferrari, and Ferrari, like the other teams, came to Monza with a selection of front wings to try out. We have the Cascade wing, which, if you notice, the flap section here hasn't been fitted in this particular picture, but it does give us a good overall shot of what's going on with the Ferrari wing, and in as much as their main plane section comes to here, and the slotted sections are more outbound on their wing. And if we take a look at the Monza specific front wing, it's very much the same arrangement as the wing I've just shown you, but instead of having the Cascade, they've decided to have these vertical turning vanes or vortex generators. Now what these do in combination is they create a spiralling vortex, much like the one I've just talked about that trails off the edge of a rear wing when it's under load. And what this will do is to obviously turn the airflow and help it use these tiered sections of the wing, but also help with the weight management of the wheel that sits behind the front wing. Now, Ferrari decided to go for a singular flap option. Usually their top flap on their front wing is split into two, much like Red Bull's, as we saw in the first few pictures. They decided that they would go for a singular flap option, and it's quite a high chord, i.e. a big distance on the wing itself. That's their Monza specific front wing. Obviously, the major differences between this and their normal wing is the loss of the cascades, the introduction of the vortex generators, and the top flap being taken from two sections down to one section. Here we can see it from the side, so we can see the height of the flap. But what I would like to point out on this particular picture is, in the normal front wing on the Ferrari, we usually see three sections here, allowing airflow to migrate from the footplate. The footplate is the outer section of the front wing that hangs off the end plate. We usually see three sections that help to manage the flow inbound towards the tiers and helps them be efficient. Whereas with this particular wing, the team decided they were getting enough airflow because they were cascadeless, that they would only need the two on the outer portion of the footplate. Rear wing, obviously another area that the team have decided to utilise some changes, and on this particular picture we can see that the wing here is full of flow vis. That helps the team to correlate the information that they're getting at the circuit with that they're seeing CFD and the wind tunnel. And obviously you can see the way that the air flows around the wing itself. Obviously I can't explain every flow regime on that particular wing because there's plenty of them, but what I can explain to you is that obviously we've got the strakes here that I've talked about on the Mercedes wing, controlling the vortices, and then we've got the end plate louvres here at the top. There's only the singular one on this particular wing from Ferrari, controlling again the drag on the outer element of the wing. But what is interesting about this particular wing over friends at Spa is we have the reintroduction of the tyre wake slots in the leading edge of the end plate here, which is an interesting turn of events for Ferrari, taking something off the car after Silverstone because they believed it didn't quite help them out, and now they've returned. But what we also have, which is something that's been on the car since the start of the season and was omitted from this particular rear wing design, is the trailing edge slats that usually adorn the rear wing here to help with efficiency, and they've been removed for Monza. So obviously they were creating an element of drag just purely by the way that they create downforce at the rear wing, and so obviously they decided to ditch those for Spa in favour of less drag. Right, moving on to the side view of the Ferrari, I'd just like to point out the semi-co-under exhaust that Ferrari have been using since last season on the F2012, and obviously migrated that design across and integrated it better into the F138. So the semi-co-under basically it's our reference to the fact that it's not a full co-under, i.e. it doesn't go down and touch the floor, it's above the floor, and that's why we call it a semi-co-under exhaust. In this particular version, which is Fernando driving the car, we've got the shorter, stumpier version, which is what Ferrari started the season with, whereas in the next picture we'll see that Felipe Massa decided to try out the extended version of that particular semi-co-under exhaust. Now, Ferrari introduced that several races ago and have dropped it. It was something that they weren't getting the increase in downforce that they thought they would from the car. They also introduced at the same point some upgrades around the frontal edge of the side pod to help with the way that the air flows to the semi-co-under exhaust, but they didn't try those out with Felipe's setup here. I think they were just trying to get some back-to-back data, and basically the way that the semi-co-under exhaust works is that the airflow down washes over the side pod here towards the exhaust. The exhaust plume is then uses the downwash to push the airflow down onto the floor and obviously below the sides of the diffuser. Obviously when we used to have exhaust blown diffusers, those were directed right alongside the diffuser itself, whereas we don't have that particular option anymore, so the team's found different ways to do it, and the co-hander exhaust is the way to do it. Airflow that comes around the side of the side pod migrates underneath the semi-co-hander exhaust and into the coke bottle region, and it's basically a mixture of airflows that cross over one another. So obviously this particular version will allow the airflow to drop further into the rear of the car. The plume itself, the exhaust plume itself, should drop further back into the car, and the shorter version will obviously drop the exhaust flow a bit closer to the rear tyre. So perhaps the team were just looking at how that airflow is affecting the rear tyres and heating the rear tyres, and trying to manage that with the change of construction from the 2013 to 2012 construction Pirelli tyres coming back into play. Moving on to Lotus, and obviously we have a look at Kimi Raikkonen's car here. The reason I'm highlighting Kimi on this particular picture is because this is the extra long wheelbase version of the Lotus, the E21, as a few of us have started calling it. And the reason that Lotus have introduced a longer wheelbase car is to help manage the difference in the tyre constructions that we've seen between the start of the season and now. It also changes the aerodynamic effect of the car. 100mm is roughly the amount that the Lotus chassis has been stretched, and that's been done by a new crash test on the front nose assembly and the actual chassis itself. 100mm might not sound a lot, but tell Adrian Newey that. I'm quite sure he'd like a difference of wheelbase so that he can adjust some of the aerodynamic characteristics of the RB9. Mind you, that will probably allow him to run away even further from the rest of the field, so let's not bother. And whilst we're here, also just a quick mention on the rear wing of this particular picture of the E21, you'll see that there's no end plate louvers on that low downforce rear wing. A close-up of the Kimi's car, and we'll see here that, as I just mentioned, end plate louvers on the rear wing, which is a Monza specific rear wing, none of those. And we've also got ourselves a shallow angle of attack on the rear wing, main plane and top flap as well, to reduce the drag. New front wing, perhaps Monza specific for the Lotus team, and we've got a new cascade element, as I've talked about earlier, with other teams moving to the cascadeless version just for Monza. The team at Lotus decided that they'd stick with their cascade, and obviously the cascade, as I've already said, will help to push airflow around and over the front tyre of the car. But what they have done is, with a narrower cascade, they've used this little blade here to take it away from the end plate, so it sits a little bit further away from the end plate than it usually would do, allowing the outer tiers of the wing to become more efficient. This is a shot of the front wing from another angle. There's a couple of things that I like to pick up on this particular shot. The main one being the arrow just here to the drooping R cascade that we see coming off the end plate, and that is a slot that's now appeared in the side of that R cascade. And furthermore, just some detailing on this particular wing, because we don't always get to see great shots of the rear of the front wing. Sutton do try to get some images of those when and as they can, but obviously the teams try to hide them from one another so that nobody can quite see what's going on all of the time with the front wings. But in this magnified section just here, which is of this particular part of the wing, it's the strake that comes from the underside of the rear of the wing, and it controls the airflow that comes from behind. And what we've got is a tiered section to that particular wing, to the strake, sorry, which will make that section of wing more efficient, and create some additional vortices which can help to control the airflow in that region. McLaren, moving on, and the team obviously suffered at the start of the season. They started to drag themselves back towards the rest of the pack now that they've moved back to the 2012 Pirelli construction. It has helped this particular team. It's resolved some of perhaps the aerodynamic issues that they had with the the issues that they had with the 2013 car in its early stages. But what we see here is the guys in the pit lane holding up a new front wing for McLaren, and it's another cascadeless front wing, choosing to sacrifice some of the turning options that the cascades bring, and obviously reduce some drag and lose a little bit of downforce from the front wing here. So there's no cascade in this section where we would normally find it on the MP428, and also the team have cut the top flap down here to further reduce some downforce. Obviously McLaren have been criticised heavily since the start of the season for their front wing adoption and the way that they design their front wing. I personally don't see massive issues with the way they do things. It's just all about efficiency and the way that you control vortices. A 3-tier wing can just be as efficient as a 7-tier wing. It just depends on what you're trying to do with that particular design process and how you're trying to turn airflow around the car, or either underneath the nose and towards the turning vanes, or whether you're turning it outwards over the front wheels. At the rear of the car, we've obviously got a rear wing that's pretty much as we saw at Spa. However, we have the rear wing end plates have been deleted. The tyre wake slots, have been deleted from the rear wing end plates. So McLaren obviously deciding that for Spa those perhaps created a little bit of drag and weren't worth the sacrifice. And as we can see, a few extra cooling slots have appeared on the MP428. Now, cooling's a strange animal for Formula 1 teams, because obviously you need to keep all of the components cool, but cooling slots mean drag. So obviously that's their compromise. They've had to make that compromise. They needed the cooling, and they've had to sacrifice a little bit of drag to have those cooling slots. Just like to thank Sutton Images for the use of their photography for the TechF1 show. It helps us obviously to explain and show you the different variances between what the teams take to the circuits week in, week out. Obviously there's a plethora of new parts. It's not always possible to get a snapshot of everything, but they obviously try their best to get all of those images, and it makes it much easier for people like myself to explain everything to you. As a new part of the show, before I did the recording this evening, I asked a few people to contact me via Twitter using the hashtag AskSummersF1, and the reason I did that was so that we could have a few questions from the floor technically, just so that we can understand perhaps what everybody else wants to know about the sport. So first off, I've got a message from Verst, which is at Holdanaba. Sorry if I mispronounced that wrong, it's obviously difficult with Twitter names. And they've asked, how likely is it that we'll see the grid completely ordered by engine next year, i.e. Renault/Merc owning the top 10? It's a possibility, but obviously Formula 1 isn't a spec series, so you will always get differences based upon aerodynamic differences as well. Obviously that's the reason why we've seen Red Bull come to the fore over the last few years with Adrian Newey at the helm, being the technical director down there. I do think that it will play a bigger role, as in the engines or the power plants will play a bigger role next season, and you might see the likes of Renault having a bigger force, for argument's sake. But there will always be, I think there'll always be the big four, for argument's sake, will always be there or thereabouts. Even McLaren, with the struggles that we've seen them have at the start of this season, have still been, relatively within the pack. 8/10 maybe is what they really are looking for, and the progressional rate of F1 doesn't allow them to catch up that 8/10. So it'll be a balancing act, I would have thought, to see who will make the difference engine power plant wise. I have heard rumours that one particular manufacturer believes they've maybe even got 100 horsepower more than the V8s, so it'd be interesting to see what kind of power we get from these newer power plants. Obviously ERS is going to play a big role in the way that power is distributed and the way that teams have to manage that energy, not only the recovery via the turbo itself, and also obviously the braking system like we've previously had with KERS, but also the way that they release that. And the fuel flow limit is going to be the biggest impact on the formula for next season. Obviously we've got a 100 kilogram weight limit for the fuel, and we've also got a fuel flow restriction, which limits the return that you can get from the fuel. I would imagine that we're perhaps looking at about 12,000 RPM as the cut line. The teams can rev out to 15,000, but there's no return after about 10,500, 11,000, so it'll be difficult for the teams to perhaps to make advantage of the additional revs. It's still something obviously that is to be decided by the engine manufacturers and the way that they work with the teams, etc. But I suspect there'll be I suspect that people won't be as disappointed as they think they currently are with these new V6 engines. And then I've got a message from Goran, which is Alajok. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce that one either. If Ferrari has chronic traction problems, why are they so persistent to not try a full co-under ramp? What he means by that is a full co-under ramp is much more like the Red Bull style of undercut system, where you have the downwash section that meets with the rear of the floor, and you have the tunnel that goes out underneath. The reason that perhaps Ferrari haven't gone down that route is maybe two or threefold, but initially what I'd say is that we have to remember that the teams are restricted by the regulations that were put in place at Germany last year, where we had the issue with the mappings of the car, the throttle maps and the pedal maps. So obviously we're working from a target map rather than just being able to do whatever the teams fancy anymore. So that they can't just simply rewrite the whole map, and that will be the largest problem I would have thought with having a different style of co-under ramp, because you're working within smaller parameter window of opportunity. The other thing is obviously aerodynamic performance. The teams will all study each other's components, so Ferrari will have undoubtedly looked at having a full co-under ramp, but perhaps in CFD and the wind tunnel the difference is only marginal, and that could be down to both the onset of aerodynamics in the way that the F138 is compared to perhaps the Lotus and the Red Bull in design, from the side pod angles, etc. It's not a simple case of let's just take one design from one car and bolt it onto another. That never particularly works. Other teams have tried that in the past, and it's not that simple. You can't just simply say, well, I like their front wing, so we'll completely copy that design, because that will then define the rest of the package. It's not as simple as just simply taking one car and taking it and designing it to meet the requirements of another. A message from Jack, which is Jay Petrolhead, another one of the tech guys, has his own YouTube show. Don't forget to check it out, it's another great show. And he asks, will we see DRD return again at some point during the rest of the season? Well, Jack, I think the problem with DRD is the amount of time that it takes to set up. I think a lot of the teams have kind of abandoned the idea of DRD purely on the basis that it takes up too much of their setup time through free practice 1 and 2. If the teams had more time to prepare the cars, then you might see DRD making more of an appearance. But it's the switch over, the point at which the drag is pulled off the car is a difficult one. Certainly wouldn't want to see it at Singapore, because there isn't the opportunity. It has to be more of a medium downforce circuit, or a medium to low downforce circuit for it to come into its own. Spa would perhaps be ideal, but it's too long a circuit and the weather characteristics don't suit, because obviously you could end up with climatic changes on different parts of the circuit, let alone one part of the circuit. So DRD is a difficult one. it could still be utilised in the 2014 regulations because of the way that the system operates centrally to the rear wing and to the rest of the car. So you could use it in the 2014 regulations to store the rear wing still. There's nothing to stop that. Charlie Whiting was talked about it at the start of the 2013 season when everybody thought that perhaps it might get banned anyway, and he referenced it as a blown wing, which is really what it is. And I don't think we'll perhaps see it used for the rest of the season on the basis that teams are obviously pushing hard to try and gain ground on one another, and gains can be made just purely through setup that can get you more from a setup change than you can from a bit of drag loss. So it's a difficult one to set up, and that's perhaps why we haven't seen the teams using it the way that we saw them use the F duct. The advantage isn't as big, and the switching factor is passive rather than driver controlled. So it's a difficult one for the teams to actually utilise. Right, I think that's it for this episode of the TechF1 Show. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you after the Singapore Grand Prix.